The snow didn't just fall in Three Pines, Wyoming. It clung to things. It clung to the roof of the train depot like a shroud, yellowed and dirty from the soot of the big, iron-bellied trains that came and went like mechanical beasts. The wind that swept across the platform wasn't just cold, it was a physical thing. A slap in the face. A hard dose of reality. And into that reality stepped Eleonora Whitlow. She got off the last car, her boots making a soft, lonely sound on the wooden planks. In one hand, she held a worn travel bag that contained everything she owned in the world. In the other, she held a fragile little thing called hope. She'd come a long way for this. She adjusted the collar of her simple navy coat and scanned the faces on the platform. They were a gallery of hardship. Leathery cattlemen, drifters with eyes that had seen too much, men worn down by the wind and worn out by their own choices. Somewhere in that crowd, she hoped to find a man named Caleb Trent. He was a rancher. He'd written her 6 letters, each one more promising than the last. He spoke of wide-open land, a fresh start, a life of decency. He signed every single one the same way. Yours in waiting. Eleonora wasn't a fool. She wasn't expecting poetry and roses. She was a practical woman who'd seen the worst of the world. All she wanted was a clean stove, a roof that didn't leak, and enough space to finally outrun her past. That was the dream. But the dream shattered in less than a minute. Her eyes caught something pinned to the wall of the telegraph office. It was a piece of paper, faded and tacked up crooked. A missing person's bulletin. Her heart didn't just sink, it stopped. The words were stark. Women vanishing, be alert. Several mail-order brides have disappeared in and near Three Pines. And then came the part that stole the air from her lungs. Suspect poses as hired hand or friend of the groom, sketch included. Eleonora's gaze fell to the drawing. It was crude, done in charcoal, but there was no mistaking it. The deep-set eyes, the narrow chin, and the scar, a small, jagged line just above the right temple. It was a face you wouldn't forget, a face she felt like she'd been running from her whole life. And that's when a voice spoke, right behind her. So close she could feel the warmth of his breath. "Miss Whitlow, is it?" She turned, slow, her body screaming at her not to. The man standing before her was wearing a dusty coat and held a crumpled hat in his hands. His boots were polished, too clean for a man who worked a ranch. But it was his smile that made her blood run cold. It was too wide, too practiced. It was a hunter's smile. And right there, just above his right temple, was a small, jagged scar. It was a perfect match. "I'm here on behalf of Caleb Trent," the man said, his voice smooth as poison. "He was delayed, asked me to come fetch you." He tipped his hat, a gesture that was meant to be charming but felt like a threat. "Wagon's out back. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch." Every muscle in Eleonora's body went rigid. Her mind was racing, screaming. This couldn't be happening. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But her gut, the same gut that had kept her alive through things far worse than this, was telling her one thing. Run. Her eyes darted back to the poster, then to the man's face. The scar, the eyes. It was him. Somehow she forced a smile. Her voice came out steady, a miracle of self-control. "I appreciate that, sir. But would you mind terribly if I used the ladies' room first? It was a very long train ride." The man's smile didn't falter. "Of course, ma'am. Take your time." He gestured to a small door at the far end of the platform. "I'll wait right here for you." Eleonora walked toward the restroom, her legs feeling like lead. Each step was an agony. She could feel his eyes on her back, watching her, waiting. She entered the small, cold room and locked the door. The click of the lock was the loudest sound she'd ever heard. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely set her bag on the cracked sink basin. This wasn't just nerves. This was pure, primal fear. This was the certainty that if she walked back out that door, she would disappear, just like the women on the poster. She looked around the tiny room, desperate. There was no other way out, just the door she'd come through, and a small, frosted window high on the back wall. It was half open. Beyond it, a snow-covered alleyway ran behind the depot. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She acted. Eleonora climbed onto the sink, her skirt tearing as she hoisted herself up. The old wooden frame of the window scraped her shoulder, but she didn't feel it. She squeezed through the opening, the frigid air a shock to her system. She dropped into a snowdrift below with a muffled thud, her bag clutched tight in her hand. And then she ran. She bolted down the alley, her boots crunching in the deep snow, her breath coming in ragged white clouds. She didn't dare look back. She just ran, putting as much distance as she could between herself and the man with the hunter's smile. Behind her, she heard the restroom door slam open. A voice, no longer smooth but sharp and angry, echoed down the alley. "Eleonora! Miss Whitlow!" She dove behind a tall stack of wooden crates, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it would break. She pressed herself into the shadows, making herself small, holding her breath. She heard his heavy footsteps stomping down the alley, heard him swearing under his breath. He was looking for her, hunting her. He passed her hiding spot without seeing her. She waited, listening as his footsteps faded. A long, shuddering breath escaped her chest. She was safe, for now. And that's when she heard the gunshot. The sound cracked through the cold air like a whip. It was close, too close. This wasn't someone hunting rabbits. This was the sound of violence. Every instinct she had screamed at her to stay hidden, to burrow into the snow and wait until the danger passed. But another instinct, the one that had made her a nurse in the bloodiest war this country had ever seen, took over. She couldn't just hide while someone was hurt. She had to know. She crept from behind the crates, moving slowly, cautiously toward the sound. She peered around the far corner of the freight barn, and that's when she saw him. A man was lying face down in the snow. A dark stain was spreading rapidly beneath him, blooming like a terrible crimson flower on the pure white ground. He wore a dark wool coat, and his hair was matted with blood. Eleonora didn't think. She forgot her own fear. She ran to him. She fell to her knees in the snow beside him, her hands immediately going to the wound. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" It was a bad one, high on his side, just beneath the ribs. Blood was seeping through her gloves, hot and sticky against the cold. She had to stop the bleeding. His eyes flickered open. They were dazed, confused, and dark with pain. He looked around, desperate, but there was no one. Just the two of them, the falling snow, and the wind, howling like a pack of wolves. "Don't try to move," she whispered, her voice a strange mix of command and comfort. "You've been shot. You're lucky. It looks like it missed your lung, but I can't stop this bleeding out here." He tried to speak, his lips cracked and blue from the cold. A single word escaped. A name. Silas. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he went limp. He'd passed out. Eleonora looked up, frantically scanning the horizon. Her own pursuer could be anywhere, but her focus was on the man bleeding out in the snow. To the north, through the swirling flakes, she saw it. A thin curl of smoke rising from the trees. A cabin. She gritted her teeth. She wasn't going to let this man die. Not here. Not like this. She stood up, took a deep breath, and began to drag him. It was brutal. He was a dead weight, and the snow was deep. Every step was an agony. Her arms burned, her lungs screamed for air, the hem of her skirt was torn to shreds. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably less than an hour before she stumbled into the clearing. The cabin was old, half buried in a drift, tucked away in a grove of ancient pines. It looked forgotten. She kicked the door open and pulled Silas inside, collapsing just over the threshold, her body trembling with exhaustion. The room was cold and smelled of cedar and old ash. It was empty, but there was a stone hearth and a small stack of firewood. It was enough. She laid Silas carefully on the dusty floor, then scrambled to the hearth. Her fingers were numb and clumsy, but she managed to get a fire lit. The warmth began to rise, slow and steady, pushing back the deadly cold. Then she turned her attention back to Silas. She gently unwrapped his heavy coat, then lifted his shirt. The wound was ugly, jagged, angry, and still bleeding faster than she liked. This was bad. He was losing too much blood. Without a second thought, she reached into her travel bag and pulled out her needle kit. It was the same one she had carried through Antietam, through Fredericksburg, through countless bloody battlefield tents, where she was the only thing standing between a soldier and his grave. Her hands, which had been trembling from cold and fear just moments before, were now perfectly steady. This, she knew, this she could do. She threaded the needle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill in the room. "Hang on, Silas," she whispered to the unconscious man. She stitched the wound closed, one careful, precise thread at a time. Her work was neat, efficient, practiced. "You're not dying in this God-forsaken cabin, not today. Not if I can help it." He didn't answer, of course, but his chest rose and fell in a slow, shallow rhythm. He was alive. Outside, the snow fell harder, blanketing the world in white. And somewhere out there, beneath that silent, falling snow, the man from the poster, the man with the hunter's smile, was still looking for her. She had escaped one monster, only to find herself trapped in a remote cabin with a dying stranger. And the storm was just beginning. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers when Silas finally stirred. Eleonora had fallen asleep sitting up, her head tipped back against the rough log wall of the cabin. Her threaded needles lay beside her in a neat cloth bundle, a testament to the desperate work she'd done hours before. The world outside was wrapped in a profound silence, the kind that only a heavy snowfall can bring. Then, a sound. A cough. It wasn't the ragged, weak cough of a man on the edge of death. It was sharp, confused. Eleonora's eyes snapped open. Silas was trying to sit up. He grimaced, a sharp intake of breath, and fell back against the floorboards with a groan. "Don't," she said, her voice soft but firm. She was already moving toward him. "You'll rip the stitches. I just finished closing the wound a few hours ago." Silas blinked, his eyes clearing slowly. He stared up at the dark, beamed ceiling. Where am I?" "In a cabin," she replied, her voice calm, betraying none of the tension coiling in her stomach. "A few miles south of the Three Pines Depot. You were shot, behind the freight barn. I found you and dragged you here." He stared at the ceiling for a long moment, his brows drawing together as he tried to piece it all together. The last thing he remembered was a flash of anger, a man's face, then a blinding pain. He looked at her, his gaze heavy with confusion. "Why?" Eleonora paused. She met his gaze directly. "Because you were dying, and because no one else was going to help you." A dry, rasping sound escaped his lips. It might have been a laugh, but it turned into a grunt of pain. "Are you a nurse? Or some kind of angel?" She didn't smile. "Some days I've been a bit of both." She let the silence hang between them for a beat before adding, "You told me your name, Silas. Do you remember anything else?" His mouth twitched. I remember being angry. There was an argument. Someone fired before I even had a chance to talk." "Talk about what?" Eleonora pressed gently. Silas didn't answer. He shifted again, wincing as the pain clamped down on him like a vice. "My coat," he muttered, his eyes darting toward the corner where she had neatly folded his blood-soaked belongings. "Inside pocket. There's something in my inside pocket." Eleonora stood and walked to the small pile. She picked up his dark wool coat. It was stiff with dried blood. She reached into the inner breast pocket and her fingers closed around a thick, sealed envelope. It felt official, important. She brought it back and handed it to him without a word. He took it, holding it in both hands as if it were a sacred object. He let out a long, weary sigh. "It's a land grant," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Eleonora's eyebrows lifted. "A land grant?" I came to Three Pines to sign over part of my father's old acreage, he explained, his voice gaining a little strength. My father was Leland Trent. The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Trent. Her throat tightened. Her pulse began to hammer in her ears. Trent? She repeated, her voice small and tight. Silas gave her a puzzled look. Yeah. Why? Do you know the name? Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. The room suddenly felt colder, smaller. I was supposed to meet a man named Caleb Trent, she said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. He owns a ranch near Three Pines. I was his mail-order bride. Silas's expression went from confusion to stone in a heartbeat. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by something hard and cold. Caleb's not a rancher, he said, his voice flat and dangerous. He's a banker from back east, a petty, greedy man with a smooth tongue and a taste for things that don't belong to him. He pushed himself up on one elbow, ignoring the pain. He locked his eyes on hers. And he's my half-brother. The words hung in the air between them, thick and heavy. Half-brother, Caleb Trent. The man who had lured her here. The man whose face was on the wanted poster was working for her supposed fiancé. And that fiancé was this wounded man's own brother. He's been trying to get his hands on this land for years, Silas continued, his voice low and laced with bitterness. First through lawyers, then through false accusations, and now, it seems, through bullets. Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. He's also running advertisements for mail-order brides, using your father's name, claiming to be a rancher. Silas flinched as if she'd slapped him. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture more monstrous than either of them could have imagined. I got off that train today thinking I was walking into a new life, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with a quiet rage. But I saw a warning poster in the station, a sketch of a man who was abducting women. And then I saw him, the man in the sketch. He said he was a friend of Caleb's, sent to pick me up. I managed to slip away, she went on, and that's when I heard the shot. That's when I found you. Silas's jaw tightened. That means he's getting desperate. The land grant has to be filed by the end of the year, or it reverts to the state. He must have known I was coming to town to file the deed. And he sent his man to stop you, Eleanor finished. We can't stay here, she said, her mind racing. The man from the station, Caleb's hired gun, was still out there. If he found them... I need a day, Silas rasped, slumping back down. Maybe 2. You sewed me up good, nurse, but I'm not standing on my own 2 feet until this fever breaks. Eleanor nodded, but a knot of fear braided itself through her shoulders. They were trapped. Silas reached into his other coat pocket and pulled out a battered pocket watch. The chain was frayed, the silver case scratched and dented. With some effort, he pried it open. He stared at the inside of the lid for a long moment, then tilted it toward her. There was no photograph inside. Instead, there was a tiny, intricate drawing of a small house, sketched in pencil. Beneath it, in neat, elegant handwriting, were 4 words. Freedom, not favor. My mother drew that, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. She was a Ute woman, born into a world that gave her very few choices. She always told me, the only thing worth building, Silas, is a place that no one can ever take from you. Eleanor stared at the tiny drawing, at the powerful words. Her chest ached with a feeling she couldn't name. You believe that? She asked softly. I did, he said, his eyes finding hers in the flickering firelight. I still do. That's why I came all this way. That's why I wouldn't let Caleb just steal it from me. She sat back down across from him, the small fire dancing between them. Outside, the wind was starting to rise again. Another storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones. But inside the cabin, a strange, tentative quiet had fallen. Silas closed his eyes, exhaustion finally claiming him again. Eleanor leaned her head back against the log wall, watching the flames, her heart hammering a soft, steady rhythm against the silence. Neither of them said it out loud. They didn't have to. Something profound had shifted in that little room. Their fates, which had been on two separate lonely paths, had violently collided in the snow. They were no longer strangers. They were allies. And they both knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that Caleb Trent wasn't just hunting for a piece of land anymore. He was hunting for them. And just beyond the edge of the trees, hidden by the falling snow, a pair of dark boot prints began a slow, deliberate circle around the cabin. The hunter was closing in, and time was running out. Morning broke gray and heavy, the world outside smothered in a fresh blanket of snow. Inside the cabin, Eleanor moved like a ghost. She checked the fire, boiled a small pot of water, and used the back of a spoon to grind some dried willow bark she'd found in her bag into a fine powder. It would help with Silas's pain. His fever had eased slightly overnight, but he was still too pale, his breathing too shallow. She stole glances at him as he slept. Part of her wanted him to stay unconscious, to rest and heal. But another part, a lonely, frightened part, desperately wanted him to wake up, just to remind her that she wasn't facing this nightmare alone. She needed to step outside. The small outhouse was barely 30 feet from the back door, but in the thick, muffled silence of the snow-covered woods, it felt a world away. She pulled on her coat, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The cold was a physical shock. As she made her way through the deep snow, she kept her head on a swivel, scanning the silent trees. It was on her way back to the cabin that she saw them, and her blood turned to ice. Tracks. They weren't hers. They weren't from when she dragged Silas to the cabin. These were fresh, a single set of deep boot prints leading in a slow, deliberate arc around the clearing. Whoever it was, they had circled the cabin. They had been watching. She knelt in the snow, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The tracks were deep, made by a heavy man. They led from the north ridge, looped around the cabin, and then disappeared back into the dense pines. He had been here. He might still be here. She stood up slowly, her eyes sweeping the woods, searching for any sign of movement, any shadow that was out of place. Nothing, not a flicker, not a sound. But she knew. They were not alone. She hurried back inside, her hands shaking as she barred the door. She didn't just latch it, she shoved a heavy wooden chair under the handle. Then she crossed the room in 2 quick strides and lifted the old rifle from the hooks above the hearth. She checked the chamber. It was loaded. She laid the rifle on the floor beside Silas. Then she shook his shoulder, gently at first, then with more urgency. "Silas," she said, her voice a harsh whisper. "Silas, wake up." He groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. What is it?" "Someone's been watching us," she said, her voice low and tight. "There are tracks, all around the cabin." That got his attention. He blinked hard, pushing himself up against the wall, hissing in pain as the movement tore at his stitches. "How long?" "I can't say for sure," she said, "but the tracks are fresh, made this morning. It was one man. He circled us and then he left. Or at least, he wants us to think he left." Silas swore under his breath, his eyes hard and alert now. "It's Lester. It has to be. He's Caleb's man. The one from the station." Eleanor nodded. "You said your brother was getting desperate." "Desperate enough to send his dog to finish the job," Silas muttered. He looked at the rifle, then at her. "Can you use one of those?" She met his gaze without flinching. Her time on the battlefields had taught her more than just how to sew up a wound. "If I have to." "Good," Silas grunted. "Then keep it close. If they know I'm not dead, they'll be back. And if they know you're with me—" "They don't," she interrupted quickly. "The man at the station, Lester, he knows me as Eleanor Whitlow. But I was careful. When I bought my ticket, I registered under a false name, left no forwarding address. I don't think Caleb has connected me to you yet." Silas leaned his head back against the wall, breathing hard. "That won't last. Caleb has money and he has spies everywhere. He's patient, but he's ruthless. If he figures out I survived that gunshot—" Then we can't be here when he does, Eleonora said, her mind already working. She poured some water into a tin cup and handed it to him. Drink this. We need to move. Before nightfall. His brow creased. Move where? In this condition? There's a place, she said, remembering a detail from an old map she'd studied before her journey. An old trapper's cabin. It's about 5 miles west of here, deeper in the woods. It was abandoned last winter. It'll have better cover, a less obvious chimney. If we stay here, we're just sitting ducks waiting for them to come back. Silas stared at her for a long, searching moment. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. A steely resolve, a strength that went bone deep. He finally gave a slow, weary nod. You're not just a nurse, are you, Eleonora? A sad, knowing look crossed her face. No, she said softly. I'm a woman who has been hunted before, and I learned a long time ago how not to get caught. He didn't press her for details. He could see the shadows in her eyes. He knew there was a story there, a dark one. But there would be time for that later, if they survived. As the weak sun struggled through the thick gray clouds, Eleonora prepared for their journey. They had precious little to take. A few jars of dried beans she found in a dusty cupboard, her roll of bandages, and a single threadbare blanket. Silas clutched the folded land deed in his coat pocket like it was the only thing anchoring him to the world. By mid-afternoon, the fever had subsided just enough. She helped him to his feet. He leaned heavily on her shoulder, every step a labored, painful effort. She wrapped his wound tightly, bundled him in every layer they had, and they stepped out into the biting cold. The snow was deeper now, but the trail west followed a natural dip in the land, a series of old deer paths and frozen creek beds. It was agonizingly slow going. Silas gritted his teeth against the pain with every step, his face pale and beaded with sweat despite the freezing temperatures. Eleonora's senses were on high alert. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of the wind through the pines sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Once, she heard a sharp crack far off in the woods behind them. It sounded like a heavy branch breaking under a boot. She stopped, turning to scan the trees. But she saw nothing but a sea of white and gray. They kept going. At dusk, just as her own legs began to tremble with strain and the cold had seeped deep into her bones, she saw it. Through the thickening snow, a dark shape appeared against the trees. A cabin. Smaller than the last one, rougher, but perfectly hidden in a dense thicket of spruce. There was no chimney smoke, no fresh tracks. For now, it was safe. She practically carried Silas the last few yards, easing him down onto a crude, straw-stuffed cot inside. She worked quickly, her hands shaking with a mixture of cold and relief, and lit a small fire in the hearth. Not a big one, just enough to keep the deadly chill at bay. He looked at her across the dim, flickering light, his eyes full of a weary gratitude. You didn't have to do any of this, he murmured, his voice hoarse. I know, she said simply. Then why did you? She hesitated, then sat on the hearth, curling her fingers around her knees and staring into the small flames. I came out here looking for a new life, she said, her voice quiet and distant. A chance to start over. Instead, I found out there are men in this world who think they can buy and sell women like cattle. I found out the man I was supposed to marry was one of them. She glanced at him, her voice growing stronger, harder. But then I found someone else. Someone who was left to die in the snow because he was trying to do the right thing. Someone who was being hunted for trying to hold on to the one thing that was his. Silas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Understanding. Kinship. I'm tired of running, Silas, she added, her voice barely a whisper. But I'm not tired of fighting. A long moment passed between them, the only sound the groan of the wind against the old wooden boards of the cabin. And then, another sound. Faint. So faint she thought she might have imagined it. The soft creak of snow under a heavy boot. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. They both went perfectly still. The air in the cabin became thick, heavy, unbreathable. Silas's eyes darted to the rifle leaning against the wall. He reached for it slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. Eleonora stood up, her own movements silent and fluid. She crossed to the single lantern and snuffed out the flame. Darkness folded in around them, absolute and terrifying. In the shadows, they waited. Silent, barely breathing. Listening. The hunter had not given up. He had followed them. The silence that followed the footstep was a living thing. It was deafening, pressing in on them from all sides. Eleonora stood with her back pressed flat against the cold, rough-hewn logs of the trapper's cabin. She held her breath until her lungs burned. Every muscle in her body coiled tight as a spring. Beside her, in the suffocating darkness, she could hear the faint, ragged sound of Silas's breathing. He was sitting rigid on the cot, the heavy rifle clutched in his hands. Nothing. No more footsteps, no movement, just the whisper of dry snow skittering across the wooden shutters, a sound as soft as a dead man's sigh. Something was wrong. This wasn't a waiting game, it was a trap. Eleonora's fingers slid along the wall until they found the edge of the window. She carefully lifted the corner of the burlap sack that served as a curtain and peered through a narrow slit. The moon had risen, casting a ghostly silver light across the snow-dusted trees. The forest was still, holding its secrets close. No shape moved. No shadow stretched where it shouldn't. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was a physical pressure against her skin. She crossed the small room, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. She knelt by the cot, her mouth close to Silas's ear. "If he's out there," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "we wait him out. We don't make a sound." Silas nodded, a faint sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead despite the bitter cold. "He's not a patient man," he breathed back. "If it's Lester, he likes to be in control. He doesn't like being uncomfortable." A cold knot tightened in Eleonora's stomach. "Lester? Caleb's man?" "He's worse than Caleb," Silas murmured, his voice laced with a venomous hatred. "Caleb manipulates. He uses words and money. Lester enjoys the cruelty. He's the kind of man who would rather watch you suffer than grant you a clean death." She swallowed hard, the fear a bitter taste in her mouth. And then it came. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. But they didn't come from the door. They came from the back wall of the cabin. Eleonora shot to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing like a cannon shot in the small, dark space. Eleonora grabbed the small hatchet she'd found by the hearth, its weight a cold, solid comfort in her hand. "It's a diversion," she whispered, her mind racing. "He's trying to draw us to the back." Another set of 3 knocks, this time louder, more insistent. Then, silence again. Despite the searing pain in his side, Silas swung his legs off the cot. He was on his feet, unsteady but determined. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Eleonora didn't argue. They edged toward the back of the cabin, moving like shadows in the oppressive dark. Eleonora dropped to her knees, pressing her eye to a crack between 2 logs. She saw him. A dark figure bent low, creeping along the base of the cabin wall. He wasn't at the back. He was moving toward the side window, the one covered only by the burlap sack. She snapped upright, her voice a harsh, urgent whisper. "He's circling! He's going for the window!" Silas turned, but it was too late. The night exploded in a shower of shattering glass and splintering wood. A heavy boot crashed through the small side window, followed by a thick, gloved hand reaching inside, fumbling for the frame to pull itself through. There was no time to think, only to act. Eleonora rushed forward, the hatchet raised high. With a desperate, guttural cry, she slammed the blade down on the intruder's arm. A terrible, animalistic howl of pain tore through the night. The arm was violently yanked back. There was a crash as the man stumbled away from the cabin, his heavy footsteps crunching frantically in the snow as he disappeared back into the darkness of the trees. They stood frozen, hearts pounding, chests heaving, staring at the shattered window pane. Dark blood was smeared across the broken sill. Silas collapsed back onto the cot, groaning as the sudden movement sent waves of agony through his side. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "You didn't even hesitate." Eleonora stood by the broken window, the hatchet still clutched in her hand. "I will not be taken," she said, her voice trembling but hard as iron. "Not by him, not by anyone. Never again." He looked at her with something akin to reverence. "You've been through hell, haven't you, Eleonora?" She didn't answer. She just stared out into the unforgiving darkness. Not yet, she thought. But I'm getting close. They spent the rest of the night in terrified shifts. One sleeping a fitful, shallow sleep, while the other stood watch, rifle or hatchet in hand. Morning came, pale and brittle. The fire was nothing but dead ashes, and the air inside the cabin was barely warmer than the air outside. Eleonora reheated the last of their broth and tended to Silas's bandages. To her immense relief, the wound wasn't infected. Her stitches were holding, but they couldn't stay. Lester was wounded, but he would be back. And next time, he would not come alone. Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the folded land deed. It was crumpled and stained, but it was still intact. "There's a safer place," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Eleonora looked at him. "Safer than this?" "My father's old ranch," he said. "It's up in Hollow Pine, about 20 miles north of here. No one's lived there for years. It's off the old cattle road. No one ever passes by unless they're lost, or they're looking for something." She frowned. 20 miles? Silas, you can barely stand. How do you expect to make it 20 miles in this snow? A weary, faint smile touched his lips. "Not alone," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But with you, maybe." It was a suicide mission. 20 miles through harsh, unforgiving wilderness with a wounded man, all while being tracked by a ruthless killer. But staying put was also a death sentence. She walked to the broken window. The blood on the frame had frozen into a dark, ugly streak. As she stared at it, she noticed something else. Something tucked into a crack between the logs, just outside the window. A small, torn piece of paper. It was wet from the snow, but the ink was dark and heavy, and the handwriting was chillingly familiar. It was a calling card. But it wasn't for a business. It was a message. "We see you, Eleanor." Her real name. Her blood ran cold. The air rushed from her lungs. It wasn't Eleonora, the name she had given at the station. It was Eleanor, the name she had tried to bury years ago. Silas saw the color drain from her face. He saw the look of sheer terror in her eyes. "What is it? What did you find?" Her hand was shaking as she held out the piece of paper. He took it. He read the 4 simple words, and then his hand clenched, crushing the paper into a tight, small ball. His knuckles were white. "They know your name," he whispered, his voice full of a terrible understanding. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "They knew it before I even stepped off that train." A heavy silence fell between them. Finally, Silas broke it. "Who are you, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice soft. "Who are you really?" She met his gaze, and for the first time she let him see the raw, hunted look in her eyes. "I'm someone who has done everything they can to disappear," she said. "And I'm someone they want back very, very badly." "Why?" She walked to the door, pushed it open, and looked out across the silent, snow-covered woods. The air was sharper now, the sky a piercing, unforgiving blue. It was as if the world was daring them to run. "Years ago," she said, not looking at him, "I escaped a man just like Caleb, different name, different town, but the same kind of evil, the kind of evil that buys and sells people." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes hard as diamonds. "I thought I got away. I turned him into the local marshal. He was never arrested. Men like that never are. But his operation crumbled. He lost everything. That's when the threats started. That's when I started running. Silas stood up with a great effort, steadying himself against the wall. A dawning, horrifying realization crossed his face. So this wasn't random, he said. This mail-order bride scheme. They weren't just looking for any woman. She gave a single, sharp nod. They were waiting for me. He drew in a sharp breath. The trap hadn't been for him and his land deed. He had just been in the way. The trap had been for her, all along. Then we move, Silas said, his voice a low growl. Right now. They packed what little they had. They layered themselves in what warmth they could find. By midday, they were on the move again, heading north into the vast, dangerous wilderness. Every step was heavy. Every sound was a potential threat. But with each painful mile they put between themselves and that blood-stained cabin, Eleanor felt something inside her begin to shift. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was focus. It was a cold, burning determination. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. And someone, somewhere, was going to pay for the blood that had been spilled in the snow. The trail to Hollow Pine was a brutal, relentless climb. The snow was deeper on the northern slopes, and a layer of ice beneath it made every step a treacherous gamble. Eleanor walked ahead, breaking the trail, her shoulders hunched against a wind that felt like it was trying to peel the skin from her bones. Behind her, Silas followed, leaning heavily on a crude walking stick she had carved for him. Each movement was stiff with pain, but he never complained. He just kept moving, his eyes fixed on her back. They hadn't spoken for hours. The sheer effort of survival had stripped them of words. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots in the snow, the groan of ancient pine limbs overhead, and the short, ragged gasps of Silas's breathing. "We're close," he said finally, his voice a raw croak. Eleanor turned, her brow furrowed with concern. He looked terrible. His face was a pale, waxy gray. "Are you sure?" He nodded, pointing with his stick toward a craggy, windswept ridge just ahead. "Past that bluff, you'll see a split-rail fence. It's probably half fallen by now. The barn roof. It used to catch the afternoon sun just right. It should still reflect, even in winter." 20 minutes later, they crested the ridge, and there it was. Tucked into a shallow, protected valley was a weathered old ranch, looking like a ghost under the heavy gray sky. The barn was leaning precariously, one side of its roof caved in. The main house was dark and silent, its windows shuttered, its wide porch choked with deep drifts of snow. But it was shelter. It was solid. It was a destination. The sight seemed to drain the last of Silas's strength. He nearly buckled, his legs giving out from under him. Eleanor rushed to his side, grabbing his arm. "Come on," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let's get inside before we freeze to death out here." They crossed the open field, every step feeling exposed and vulnerable. The vast whiteness made them a clear target from any direction. Once they reached the porch, Eleanor put her shoulder to the heavy front door and pushed. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound of long disuse. The air inside was stale and cold, thick with the smell of dust and decay. But the walls were sturdy, and the huge stone fireplace in the main room was intact. Faintly, beneath the smell of rot, she could detect the scent of old hay and pine, the scent of a home that had once been lived in. They worked quickly, a silent, efficient team. Eleanor cleared a space near the hearth and, using the last of her matches, coaxed a small fire to life. Silas, meanwhile, limped through the downstairs rooms, checking the pantry. He found a few dusty jars of long-expired preserves, but nothing edible. He collapsed into a rickety wooden chair by the fire and exhaled heavily, the weight of the last few days, and maybe his whole life, catching up to him all at once. Eleanor sat across from him, her hands outstretched to the fledgling flames. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then Silas broke the silence. "This place was meant to be mine," he said, his voice distant, full of old sorrow. "But after my mother died, my father, He buried himself in his railroad business. He hired men to run the ranch and sent me away to boarding schools back east. He couldn't stand to be here without her. Eleanor glanced at him. You wanted the ranch? I wanted a life I could shape with my own 2 hands, he said. Something real, not just numbers on a ledger in some dusty city office. She nodded slowly. I know what that's like, she said softly. That's all I ever wanted too. A real life. I never found it. Silas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes searching hers in the firelight. What really happened to you, Eleanor? Before all this? Before the train? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared into the fire, as if the flames held the answer, as if she was searching for the right words, or maybe just the courage to speak the truth. Finally, she did. I was 16, she began, her voice a low, flat monotone. A man came to my town. He was charming, handsome. He promised me the world. He promised me marriage. She let out a short, bitter laugh. I was young. I believed him. Within a week, she continued, her eyes still fixed on the fire, he had sold me. Silas didn't move. He didn't speak. He just listened. I escaped, she said. I ran. I hid in a mining town in Colorado under a different name. I started over. I learned to be a nurse. I tried to build a life. She finally looked at him, her eyes burning with a cold, old fire. But he found me, Caleb. That was his name then, too. He said I owed him. He said I cost him a fortune when I ran. I knew if I didn't run again, I'd end up like the other girls, the ones who didn't escape. He reached across the small space between them and gently took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. You didn't deserve any of that, Eleanor. She squeezed his hand, a silent thank you, grateful for the simple warmth of human contact, grateful for the absence of pity in his voice. That night, they slept in shifts again, the fire crackling between them, a small beacon of warmth in the vast, cold darkness. Sometime before dawn, Eleanor was woken by a sound, a faint scraping noise. She sat bolt upright, her heart instantly pounding. Silas was already awake, his eyes fixed on the front door, the rifle in his hands. The scraping came again. It wasn't coming from the front of the house. It was coming from the back, from the direction of the collapsed barn. She crept to the frosted window, careful not to disturb the delicate patterns of ice on the glass. In the faint pre-dawn light, she could see a set of fresh tracks in the snow. They led from the tree line directly to the old barn. Boot prints, deep and deliberate. But there was no one there now. She woke Silas fully, and they dressed quickly in the frigid air. As they moved toward the back of the house to investigate, another sound reached them, the soft snort of a horse and the pawing of a hoof in the snow. Eleanor stepped out onto the back porch, and there it was, a small tan mare tied loosely to the fence post. It was saddled and bridled, its sides still steaming from exertion, but there was no rider. She turned back to Silas, her eyes wide. Someone's here, she whispered. Or they were. Silas raised the rifle. Then let's hope they didn't leave something worse behind. They approached the dilapidated barn slowly, cautiously, Eleanor carrying a lantern she'd found in the house. The heavy barn doors hung crookedly on their hinges. They slipped inside. The scent of horses and old, dry hay greeted them. And something else. Something that made the hairs on the back of Eleanor's neck stand up. A low moan. She lifted the lantern higher, its yellow light cutting through the gloom. And then she saw her. A woman. She was lying in a crumpled heap near an empty feed trough. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough rope. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her voice. Eleanor rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the woman. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey, you're safe now. You're safe." The woman flinched at the sound of her voice, trying to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. Silas knelt beside them and with his knife carefully cut the bindings on her wrists. Together they helped the woman to her feet and half carried her back to the house. They wrapped her in blankets, propped her up by the fire, and Eleanor gently spooned warm water between her cracked lips. It took nearly an hour before the woman could form a complete sentence. My name is Clara," she rasped, her voice a fragile, broken thing. He said he'd marry me. He brought me all the way from Tennessee. Then he locked me in that barn." Eleanor's stomach twisted into a tight, sick knot. Was it Caleb? She asked gently. Was it Caleb Trent? Clara shook her head weakly. No, it was the other one. The one with the dead eyes. They called him Lester. Silas's eyes darkened. He left me here this morning, Clara continued, her voice breaking. He said he had to go pick up another girl from the train. He said this time she'd be more willing. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Me? She whispered. Clara nodded slowly, tears finally starting to stream down her face. He said you had fire. He said your name was Eleanor, and he said he was going to be the one to finally break you. Eleanor stood up, her fists clenched at her sides, her heart racing with a terrifying, furious energy. Silas met her gaze from across the room. It was a look of grim, deadly resolve. We end this, he said, his voice low and final. Eleanor gave a single sharp nod. No more running, no more hiding. The hunt was over. It was time to set a trap of their own. The snow had finally stopped, but the cold had settled in for a long siege, clinging to every surface like a death grip. Inside the ranch house, a fragile alliance had been forged in the crucible of shared trauma. Eleanor sat at the dusty kitchen table, gently spooning warm broth into Clara's mouth. The girl was weak, her body a roadmap of bruises, but there was a flicker of defiance returning to her eyes. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shing-shing-shing of steel on stone filling the quiet house. It was a sound of preparation, a sound of impending battle. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. This was about stopping the monsters who had torn their lives apart. She's stable, Eleanor said softly, setting the spoon down. Clara had fallen into an exhausted sleep. But she needs a doctor, real care. She can't stay on this mountain much longer. She won't have to, Silas said, his voice calm, but tight around the edges. He didn't look up from his knife. Neither will you. Eleanor looked at him, at the hard set of his jaw, the cold fire in his eyes. We're not leaving this unfinished, Silas. No, he said, finally looking up. We're not. He stood, walked to the heavy wooden mantel above the fireplace, and took down a small tin box she hadn't noticed before. He pried open the lid. Inside were a few folded, yellowed letters, a small, faded photograph of a woman with kind, sad eyes, his mother, and a worn, hand-drawn map. The map was covered in notes, scrolled in a neat, firm hand, his father's hand. He laid the map flat on the table between them. This, he said, pointing to a small X marked in red ink, is where Caleb is holding the others. Eleanor leaned in, her eyes wide. How do you know that? Because the night he had me shot, Silas said, his voice a low growl. I wasn't completely out. I was drifting in and out. I heard him giving instructions to Lester. The old line shack east of the Twin Ridges, he said. He wasn't even whispering. He was arrogant. He thought I'd be dead before I could ever repeat it. From her makeshift bed near the hearth, Clara's eyes fluttered open. She had heard him. The line shack, she whispered, her voice trembling. The place with no windows. That's where he took me first. Silas's finger was still on the X. It's an old shelter for his father's cowhands. No one's used it in 20 years. It's completely secluded, far enough from town to be invisible, but close enough for him to manage his business. He spat the word like poison. He's not just selling them, Eleanor. He's warehousing them, rotating them through like livestock. Eleanor swallowed hard, a wave of nausea washing over her as she stared at the small letters on the map. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "How many women do you think are there?" It was Clara who answered, her voice thin but clear. "Dozens," she said. "He bragged about it. He told me I was number 13, just this winter." Silas let the horrifying number settle in the silence of the room. Then he looked at Eleanor, his eyes blazing. "Then we have to move now, while we still have the element of surprise." Eleanor hesitated. "Silas, you're not strong enough for a fight. Your wound—" He held up a hand, cutting her off. "I've been hunted, shot, and left for dead," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound strength. "That doesn't make me weak, Eleanor. That makes me dangerous." Clara coughed softly, pushing herself up on one elbow. "There's someone," she said. "Someone in town. A woman named Abigail Marrow. She runs the newspaper, the Eldridge Telegraph, but she's more than that. She's part of a group. They help women. Women like us." Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "A network?" Clara nodded. "They call themselves The Ring. I don't know much, but Abigail, she helped me once, years ago, before I came west. She's brave. She'll believe you." Silas turned to Eleanor. "You have to be the one to go. You're strong enough to make the ride, and you're the only one who can get into town without raising suspicion. I'll stay here with Clara. I'll watch the ridge. If Lester comes back looking for his lost property, he won't be leaving this mountain again." Eleanor's first instinct was to argue, to say she wouldn't leave them, but she saw the look on his face. It was a look of pure, resolute purpose. He wasn't just being brave, he was giving her a direct order, and he was saying goodbye, just in case. She gave a single, solemn nod. They made a plan. At first light, Eleanor would ride for the town of Eldridge. She would take the old, forgotten trail behind the ridge, staying clear of the main road. She would wear a dark coat Silas had found in the barn, tuck her hair beneath a wool cap, and if anyone stopped her, she would be a trader's daughter, returning from a family visit. She would find Abigail Marrow. She would expose Caleb Trent, and she would bring the full force of the Ring down on his evil empire. That night, the three of them sat by the fire, a strange, wounded family bound together by a shared enemy. Eleanor cleaned the rifle with meticulous care. She packed dried meat and a skin of water in a saddlebag, and she slipped a small piece of paper with Clara's trembling handwriting on it into her coat. A last testament, just in case she didn't make it, just in case someone else had to finish the story. Dawn broke slow and silver over the snow-capped peaks. Eleanor stood by the tan mare in the barn, one hand on the cold leather of the saddle horn, the other curled tight into a fist. Silas stood beside her, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "You ride careful, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "I always do," she replied. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, wrapped in a piece of soft doeskin. "This was my mother's," he said, unfolding the cloth. It was a simple silver pendant, a perfect circle with a single sky-blue turquoise bead set in the center. She wore it every day. She said it kept her strong when the world tried to make her feel small. He pressed the pendant into her hand. Its silver was cool against her skin. Eleanor's throat was too tight to speak. She just nodded her thanks. They didn't hug. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to. The unspoken words hung in the cold air between them, more powerful than any embrace. She mounted the horse, turned it toward the hidden trail, and rode away without looking back. She would ride to Eldridge. She would find the journalist, and she would drag Caleb Trent's dark secrets into the blinding light of day. And if he came for Silas and Clara before she could get back, well, he would find out that he had picked the wrong woman to break. The wind was a different beast in Eldridge. It howled down the narrow main street, kicking up dust and snow, rattling the windows of the false-fronted buildings. It was a meaner wind than the one on the mountain, a civilized wind, full of the hurried, angry sounds of men. Eleanor dismounted in front of the Eldridge Telegraph Building. It was a squat, unimpressive structure, Its front window cracked, the whole place smelling of old ink and damp paper. She tied the mare's reins to the hitching post, pulled her coat tighter around her, and stepped inside. The front room was empty, save for a massive, hulking printing press in the back, still warm to the touch. A woman stood beside it, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her arms smudged with dark ink. She looked up the moment Eleanor entered, her sharp, intelligent gray eyes giving her a quick, thorough appraisal from boots to brow. "That's a hell of a storm to ride through just to read yesterday's news," the woman said, her voice dry and devoid of pleasantries. Eleanor took a breath. "You're Abigail Marrow." "I am," the woman replied, not missing a beat. "And you're not from around here." "No," Eleanor said, "but you've helped women like me before." The smallest muscle in Abigail's jaw tightened. She set down the heavy block of metal type she was holding and wiped her inky hands on a rag. "Come with me." She led Eleanor into a small back room, lit by a single narrow window and warmed by a small pot-bellied stove. She poured 2 cups of tea from a battered kettle and sat down, not asking any questions, just waiting. The silence was an invitation. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket, her fingers closing around the crumpled note Clara had written. She laid it on the table between them. Abigail didn't reach for it. She simply leaned forward and read the shaky, upturned handwriting, her expression changing slowly, her face tightening with each word until it was a hard, grim mask. "Clara," she said finally, her voice a low, stunned whisper. "She's alive." "She's with a man named Silas," Eleanor said. "Up at an old ranch in Hollow Pine. He saved her life. He was shot by Caleb Trent's man." "We thought she was gone," Abigail murmured, almost to herself. "She vanished 3 months ago. Not a word, not a trace. Lester claimed he saw her board a train back to St. Louis. I never believed him." "She didn't make it to St. Louis," Eleanor said, her voice hard. "She didn't even make it to the ranch she was promised. They drugged her. They were going to sell her. She escaped." Abigail looked up then, and for the first time, she wasn't looking at Eleanor's worn coat or the dirt under her fingernails. She was looking into her eyes. "And you?" she asked. "What's your story?" "I was supposed to marry Caleb Trent," Eleanor said. "Only he wasn't a rancher, and I was just the bait in a trap set for me a long time ago." Abigail's eyes narrowed. "Caleb Trent is a ghost. He doesn't leave tracks. He has money and power. No one in this territory with a badge is willing to cross him." "That's why I'm here," Eleanor said, leaning forward. "I don't need a man with a badge. I need you. Clara said you were part of something, a network. She called it the Ring." Abigail didn't answer right away. She stood up, walked to a tall, locked cabinet in the corner, and opened it with a small iron key. She pulled out a folder so thick it bulged at the seams. She brought it to the table and opened it. Inside were dozens of photographs of young women, torn letters full of hope, hand-drawn maps of remote cabins, and newspaper clippings of wedding announcements and missing person reports. Women's names were underlined in red ink. So many names. "They think we're soft," Abigail said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "They think because we're women, because we don't carry guns and swagger down the street, that we're weak." She tapped the folder with a finger. "But we don't need guns to fight them. We have the truth, and we can print it faster than they can bury their bodies." She slid a clipping across the table to Eleanor. It was a wedding announcement from 6 months prior. A pretty, smiling girl, no older than 16. "This one never arrived either," Abigail said. Her letters stopped. Caleb's man said she ran off with a gambler. She was sent to a cabin north of here. Eleanor's voice cracked. Do you think she's in the line shack with the others?" Abigail's face was grim. "I think she's gone, Eleanor, but there might be others who aren't, so what are we going to do about it?" "You print the truth," Eleanor said, her resolve hardening. "You send word to the Ring. We can cut off Caleb's trade routes, expose him." Abigail gave her a long, searching look. Then a slow, small smile touched her lips. It was the first time Eleanor had seen her smile, and it was a fearsome thing. "You're not like the others who come to me for help," she said. "You're not just looking for a way out." "I'm exactly like the others," Eleanor corrected her. "I'm scared and I'm tired, and I've been broken, and that's why I won't stop. Not until he's finished." Abigail nodded. "All right then," she said, standing up. "Come with me." She led Eleanor out a back door, down a narrow, frozen alley, and to a side entrance that led into the newspaper's storage cellar. Beneath stacks of ink pots and heavy reams of newsprint was a wooden trapdoor hidden under a rug. Abigail heaved it open, revealing a ladder leading down into the darkness. "After you," she said. Eleanor descended into a tunnel, dimly lit by oil lamps. It was carved from the cold, damp earth, and there, in the flickering subterranean light, were 4 other women. 2 were dressed in simple frocks, far too thin for the Wyoming winter. Another, a tall, stern-faced woman, had a rifle slung over her shoulder, and a 4th was hunched over a large table, meticulously marking up maps. This was the ring. Abigail's voice echoed in the close confines of the tunnel. "Sisters," she announced, "we have a new one. Her name is Eleanor, and she's going to help us bring down Caleb Trent for good." It was 2 nights later when Eleanor rode back up the mountain. She wasn't alone this time. 2 riders from the ring, silent and grim-faced, followed at a distance. Tucked inside her boot was a coded message from Abigail, outlining the final plan. She arrived at the ranch just before dawn. Silas met her at the barn door. He looked weary, but his eyes were steady and clear. "Clara?" Eleanor asked, swinging down from her horse. "She's stronger," he said, "and she's asking for you." Eleanor stepped inside the warm house. Clara was seated by the fire now, wrapped in quilts. The color had returned to her cheeks, and the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, fierce resolve. "You did it," Clara whispered. "Not yet," Eleanor said, kneeling beside her and taking her hand. "But we will." And as the first rays of sun lifted above the jagged peaks, casting long, dramatic shadows through the pines, they readied themselves for the final act. Caleb Trent had laid a trap for countless women. Now, that trap was about to be turned on him. The man who thought he could buy and sell human souls was finally going to learn what it felt like to be the one who was hunted. The snow fell lightly, like a final, gentle sigh over the valley. Eleanor and Silas stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as Clara, bundled in a heavy cloak provided by the ring, mounted her horse. Her movements were still careful, her ribs still tender, but her spirit was no longer captive. It was free, and it was strong. She wasn't going back east, to a life she no longer knew. She was going to Eldridge. She was going to work with Abigail. She had a new purpose. There were other women to save. Eleanor handed her a small satchel. "There's food, letters from the other women in the cellar, and Abigail's map." Clara leaned down from her horse and hugged Eleanor tightly. "Don't let him slip away, Eleanor." "I won't," she promised. Silas stood by his own horse, his face a mask of rugged calm. But Eleanor could see the tightness in his jaw, the storm in his eyes. He turned to her. "Are you sure you want to be there?" he asked, his voice low. "When we take him?" "I have to be," she said. "He needs to see my face. He needs to know it was me." They waited until dusk. Word had come through the ring's network, a name whispered over a telegraph line, disguised as a shipment manifest. Caleb Trent was scheduled to arrive at a remote way station just west of Morrow Ridge. His newest shipment was to be loaded onto a hidden freight car, destined for the mining camps in the north. It was supposed to be a quick, silent, invisible transaction. But this time, there would be witnesses. Eleanor rode with Silas. Behind them, a small, determined band of 5 women from the ring followed, their faces set and grim. No lawmen, no federal marshals, just the survivors and the man who had stood between them and oblivion. They dismounted in the trees just above the way station. Abigail and her team were already in position. They weren't armed with rifles. They were armed with pens, cameras, and flash powder. They were armed with the truth, and they were ready to print it. Eleanor crouched low behind a fallen pine, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. She watched as a wagon rolled into the clearing below, and there he was, Caleb Trent. Bundled in a fine, expensive coat, he stepped down from the driver's seat with the casual arrogance of a man who had never known a single moment of consequence. He started barking orders at the two men who were with him. They jumped to obey. Men like Caleb were always obeyed. The moment hung in the cold, still air, stretched taut like a wire. Then Silas stepped out from the trees. Caleb's head snapped up. His face, for a split second, was a mask of disbelief. "What the—" Silas walked slowly, deliberately into the clearing, his hands at his sides. He stopped 10 feet from his half-brother. "I told you to stay off my land, Caleb." Caleb's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You should be dead." "Almost was," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm. "Thanks to you." And from the shadows on the other side of the clearing, Eleanor stepped forward. If Caleb was shocked to see Silas, he was utterly shattered to see her. The color drained from his face. All the arrogance, all the power, evaporated in an instant. "No," he whispered, his voice a choked, strangled sound. "I'm alive," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as ice. "And I'm done running from you." He fumbled inside his coat, his hand reaching for a weapon. But before his fingers could close around it, the night exploded in a blinding white flash. Abigail's camera. Then another flash, and another. From the back of the wagon, the false floorboards were thrown open. 2 young women, the shipment, scrambled out, screaming for help. The women from the ring swarmed into the clearing, their voices rising in a chorus of accusation, calling out his name. A crowd of townspeople, alerted by flyers Abigail had printed and posted that very morning, began to gather at the edge of the woods, their murmurs growing into an angry roar as they recognized the wealthy banker from Eldridge. It wasn't violence that brought Caleb Trent down. It was exposure. It was the truth, flooding in like a tidal wave, faster than he could run, faster than he could hide. By the time the county sheriff finally arrived, looking flustered and useless, Caleb Trent was already on his knees in the snow, his face in his hands, surrounded by the ghosts he thought he had buried. They didn't celebrate that night. It wasn't joy they felt. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the simple act of breathing, a collective exhale that had been held for far, far too long. 3 nights later, Eleanor stood on the porch of Silas's ranch house, watching the moon rise over the quiet mountains. The air was thin and crisp. The danger had passed, but something deep inside her had been fundamentally changed. She felt, rather than heard, Silas step up beside her. "She's safe," he said quietly. "Clara, Abigail sent word. She's safe." Eleanor nodded. "And so are the others, for now." He looked at her, really looked at her, his gaze soft in the moonlight. "And you, Eleanor? Are you planning on staying?" She didn't answer right away. She traced the dark outline of the pines against the starry sky. She looked at the sturdy old house, the quiet barn, the horses grazing peacefully in the meadow. "I never wanted this life," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not like this. I came here to marry a stranger, just to get a piece of land. That feels like someone else's story now." "What do you want now?" he asked. Eleanor turned to him, and in the pale moonlight, he could see the strength and the sorrow and the hope all mingled in her eyes. "A place where I don't have to trade parts of myself just to be safe," she said. "A place where the truth matters." Her voice dropped, becoming softer, more vulnerable. "And maybe someone who sees all of me, even the parts I've never said out loud." Silas didn't speak. He simply reached out and took her hand in his. And in that simple, quiet gesture, she found her answer. A month later, the Eldridge Telegraph published its most famous edition. The headline in big, bold letters read, "Ring of Stolen Brides Broken. Banker Caleb Trent, sentenced by testimony of his victims. Beneath it was a grainy but clear photograph of Eleanor standing beside Silas, the rugged Wyoming mountains rising up behind them like a promise. In her small office, Abigail Marrow pinned that photograph to the wall, right alongside dozens of others. A gallery of survivors, a testament to the fighters, a monument to the women who had turned their silence into a righteous roar. Far up in the hollow pine valley, where the snow still kissed the treetops and the silence was a kind of peace, Eleanor stepped into the barn beside Silas. She wrapped her arms around his waist and rested her head against his strong back, breathing in the scent of hay and home. For the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the unexpected. And let me know in the comments below, what would you have done if you were in Eleanor's shoes?